Ranger, get in the truck!
Caleb Rowan shouted through the rain, but the German shepherd stayed at the mansion door.
Come on, boy. We're done.
Inside Caleb's duffel was the box Ranger had found behind the library wall. Old photographs, a soldier's tag, and a letter sealed for 16 years. That morning, Alder Creek had laughed.
A homeless veteran bought a Mafia mansion?
By sunset, someone warned.
Hand it over, Caleb. That house doesn't belong to men like you.
Caleb looked at the dark doorway and whispered.
Maybe they're right.
Ranger didn't move. He sat beneath the rain-soaked arch. Guarding the truth Caleb was seconds from abandoning. Rain softened Alder Creek that morning, running along cracked sidewalks and gathering beneath the rusted meters outside City Hall, where a small crowd had come less for business than for entertainment. Nobody expected anything important from a municipal property auction full of ruined lots, boarded storefronts, and houses with roofs sagging like old shoulders. Then Caleb Rowan walked in with a German shepherd at his side, and the room changed without anyone saying a word. He was 42, though the lines around his eyes made him look older in certain light. His brown jacket had been mended at one sleeve. His boots were clean but worn thin at the edges. He carried himself with the quiet posture of a man who had once stood in formation, but now spent too many nights trying to disappear in the back seat of a Ford pickup. Beside him, Ranger moved with calm purpose, black and tan coat damp from the rain, amber eyes steady, ears lifted, as if the dog had heard something in the walls that human beings were too busy judging to notice. A few people turned in their chairs. One woman lowered her voice, but not enough. "That's the man who sleeps behind Miller's stop." Someone else chuckled. Caleb heard it. Men like him learned to hear everything. The pause before a waitress asked if they were ordering anything else. The click of car locks in parking lots. The word veteran, spoken with respect at ceremonies and suspicion everywhere else. Caleb did not look back. He placed one hand lightly on Ranger's head, and the dog sat beside his left boot like a promise that had learned to breathe. At the front of the room, the city clerk, a narrow man named Paul Granger, shuffled through the final papers with the weary impatience of someone who wanted the morning over. "Last property," he said, adjusting his glasses. Parcel 914, known locally as the Whitcomb House, located on Hawthorne Ridge. Formerly held under the Mallory estate. Structure abandoned 16 years. Buyer assumes all liability, unpaid maintenance orders, and restoration compliance. A murmur moved through the room, low and uneasy. Even people who had come only to laugh sat a little straighter. The Whitcomb House was not just another abandoned building. It was the old gray mansion above town. Half hidden behind iron gates and dead ivy, the one drivers slowed down to stare at before pressing the gas a little harder. It had belonged to Silas Mallory, a name Alder Creek still handled carefully like broken glass wrapped in newspaper. Some called him a businessman, some called him worse. Most simply stopped talking when his name came up. "Opening transfer fee," Granger said, clearing his throat. $150. The fee was not the value of the house. It was the city's way of passing a condemned burden to anyone willing to claim the taxes, repairs, and liability that came with it. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind with teeth. No one raised a hand. Rain tapped against the tall windows. A fluorescent light buzzed above the back row. Ranger turned his head toward the framed photograph on the side wall, an old black and white picture of Hawthorne Ridge from decades earlier. In it, the Whitcomb House stood proud and clean above the town, its windows bright, its stone face untouched by rumor. Ranger stared at it so intently that Caleb glanced down. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. The dog did not move. Granger sighed. "No bidders." Caleb stepped forward. Chairs creaked as people turned. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, softened from being carried too long. The money inside was not crisp. It was made of small jobs, skipped meals, fixed gutters, hauled lumber, and coffee gone cold in paper cups. He laid it on the table. 150, he said. His voice was low, even, and perfectly clear. For half a second, nobody reacted. Then a laugh came from the back. "He can't afford a room," a man said, "but he wants a mansion." This time the room laughed with him. Not everyone, but enough. Caleb stood still. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He had learned long ago that dignity did not always look like winning. Sometimes it looked like not giving people the satisfaction of seeing where they had cut you. Ranger rose without a sound and stepped closer until his shoulder touched Caleb's leg. The laughter thinned. The dog looked across the room, not angry, not threatening, simply present in a way that made a few people look down first. Granger hesitated, then tapped the gavel once. Sold. The Whitcomb house transfers to Caleb Rowan, pending final documentation. The sound of the gavel seemed too small for what it had done. Caleb picked up the old brass key from the table. It was heavier than he expected, cold against his palm, its teeth darkened with age. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled beyond the low Pennsylvania hills. As he turned to leave, Ranger stopped again beneath the photograph of the mansion. The dog lifted his nose, drew in a slow breath, and gave one soft whine. Not fear, not recognition exactly, but the kind of stillness Caleb had learned never to ignore. Caleb looked from Ranger to the picture, then to the key in his hand. For the first time that morning, the laughter behind him felt far away. The town believed he had just bought a curse. Caleb did not know what he believed yet. He only knew that a house nobody wanted had stopped a man nobody noticed. And somehow Ranger had understood that before he did. 3 mornings before Caleb Rowan placed $150 on the auction table, he woke to the soft scrape of Ranger's paw against the dashboard glass. Dawn had not yet broken over Alder Creek. The world outside the Ford F-150 was still blue and shapeless, wrapped in the kind of cold that did not shout, only settled into your bones and waited there. Behind Miller's Stop, where the old gas station sign blinked half its letters into the dark, MLLR Soap, Caleb sat up slowly beneath a wool blanket that smelled faintly of rain, dog fur, and the pine-scented soap from the shelter showers. His breath clouded the windshield. For a moment before memory returned, the truck almost felt like a room, almost. Then his shoulder brushed the steering wheel. His boot knocked against a crate of folded clothes, and the truth came back in its usual quiet way. He was 42 years old. He owned everything he could reach without opening the door. Ranger watched him from the passenger seat, ears lifted, amber eyes patient but serious, as if he had been waiting for Caleb to return to himself. "I'm up," Caleb murmured, voice rough. "You win." Ranger gave a low huff, not quite a bark. Caleb smiled despite himself. It was small, gone almost as soon as it arrived, but it was real. He wiped the fog from the inside of the windshield with the sleeve of his jacket, then reached for the plastic jug wedged behind the seat. He poured water into Ranger's dented metal bowl first, always first. Only after the dog had lowered his head and begun to drink did Caleb unscrew the lid from yesterday's coffee, cold and bitter in a paper cup from the diner. He took one swallow and made a face. "Luxury living," he said. Ranger looked up with water dripping from his muzzle. Caleb folded the blanket with the careful corners of a man who still believed order mattered, even when the world had stopped offering him much of it. He shaved using the side mirror, dragging the razor slowly over his jaw, while trucks passed on the road beyond the chain-link fence. Some drivers looked away. Some stared too long. Caleb had learned that being seen and being noticed were not the same thing. He could walk through a room and feel every pair of eyes measure his jacket, his boots, the leash in his hand, the tired truck waiting outside. He heard the soft shift in voices when he entered a diner. He heard the word "sir" disappear from conversations the moment people decided he had no address worth respecting. Still, every morning he stepped into May's diner with his chin level, Ranger heeling close enough that his shoulder brushed Caleb's leg. He ordered black coffee and toast when he had the money, just coffee when he didn't. "Thank you, Mom," he always said when the waitress set the cup down, even on mornings when she never quite met his eyes. Caleb did not complain. Complaining, he had learned, made people either pity you or defend themselves from you, and he had no appetite for either. He had once had a little house outside Lancaster, with white trim and a porch he meant to repair in the spring. He had once had a woman named Allison, who wore her hair in a loose braid on Sundays and kept a calendar full of plans on the refrigerator. He had once had men who called him brother and meant it. He had once known exactly where to stand, when to move, what to carry, who counted on him. Then service ended, and life did not open like a parade route. It narrowed. First came the sleepless nights. Then the jobs that started well and ended quietly. Then the stack of envelopes he stopped opening right away. Then the ring returned in a small padded mailer, with a note too kind to hate. Friends called less often, not because they were cruel, but because sadness made people feel helpless, and helplessness made them busy. Nothing exploded, nothing dramatic enough to explain the ruin. His life simply loosened one knot at a time, until one morning he realized he was sleeping in his truck and calling it temporary. Ranger was the only one who never adjusted his love to fit Caleb's circumstances. When Caleb skipped dinner, the dog nudged the paper bag toward him. When Caleb sat too long staring through the windshield at nothing, Ranger laid his head across Caleb's knee with the weight of something alive and loyal and impossible to ignore. On the morning Caleb found the notice, rain had just begun to mist over the steps of St. Bartholomew's, the old brick church near the closed textile mill. He had stopped there because the church basement served coffee on Tuesdays, and because no one there asked more than a man could answer. On the bulletin board beside job postings, lost keys, and a flyer for free winter coats, one sheet of paper had been pinned slightly crooked. City auction. Abandoned property. Buyer assumes all responsibility. Beneath it, in smaller print, was a name that seemed to dim the hallway around it. The Whitcomb House. Hawthorne Ridge. Caleb read it twice. Behind him, Ranger went still, not alert in the way he got when a door opened. Still in the way he became when something old and buried had shifted beneath the surface of the day. Caleb looked down at him, then back at the notice. A house no one wanted, left standing only because tearing it down would require someone to care. He gave a short, breathless laugh that held no humor at all. "Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" he whispered. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg, and for the first time in years, Caleb did not see an ending on a piece of paper. He saw a door. By the time Caleb and Ranger reached Hawthorne Ridge, the rain had stopped, but the world had not yet decided to clear. Low clouds hung over Alder Creek like sheets of old tin, dull and heavy, pressing the last color out of the afternoon. The road climbed slowly out of town, past the closed textile mill, bare maples, and moss-darkened stone walls. Wet leaves clung to the tires of Caleb's Ford as it moved up the hill, the engine coughing once, then steadying. As if even the truck understood, this was not a place to approach too quickly. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, nose lifted toward the cracked window. He had been quiet since they left City Hall, not sleepy, not calm in the usual way, watchful. Caleb noticed because there were few things left in the world he trusted, and Ranger's silence was one of them. "You smell something?" he asked. The dog did not look at him. Ahead, the iron gate appeared between two leaning oaks, its bars bent with age, the Mallory crest still fixed in the center, though time had eaten half the detail away. The gate sagged inward like the spine of an old man who had carried one secret too many. Caleb parked before it and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Beyond the gate, at the end of a long gravel drive littered with branches and rain-polished leaves, stood the Whitcomb house. It rose from the hill in gray stone and shadow, 3 stories tall, wide-shouldered, stubborn, and strangely patient. Ivy crawled across its walls like dark veins. Several windows were cracked, and the unbroken ones reflected the cold sky so perfectly. They looked less like glass than blind eyes. The roof dipped at the western corner. A fountain in the circular drive sat empty except for leaves, mud, and one small pool of rain that trembled whenever the wind moved. Caleb had expected the house to feel dead. It did not. That was the first thing that unsettled him. Dead things were finished. This place felt unfinished, as if it had been holding its breath for 16 years, and had only now heard footsteps coming up the drive. A white city sedan was already waiting near the porch. Nora Keene stood beside it with a clipboard tucked under one arm, and the collar of her raincoat pulled high. She was in her 50s, with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and a face that suggested she preferred facts to stories, though the house behind her made facts feel thin. She gave Caleb a polite nod, the careful kind people used when they had not decided whether to pity you or warn you. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "you found it." Caleb stepped out, then opened Ranger's door. Hard to miss. Ranger jumped down, landing softly on the wet gravel. His ears lifted at once. Nora's eyes moved to the dog, then back to Caleb. "Before I hand this over, I need to say something unofficial." She glanced toward the mansion, and for the first time her professional expression loosened. "People say that house keeps what it takes." Caleb looked at the dark windows. A gust of wind slipped through the ivy and made the leaves whisper against the stone. He could have laughed. He could have said he did not believe in town gossip or ghosts or curses dressed up as local history. Instead, he thought of his truck behind Miller's stop, of the diner waitress looking past him, of old friends who had run out of words. "Maybe no one ever gave it anything worth keeping," he said. Nora studied him for a second, as if deciding whether the answer was foolish or sad. Then she placed the brass key in his palm. "Water's on, but I wouldn't trust the pipes yet. Electricity is limited to the main floor. Some rooms are unsafe. Don't use the back stairs, and don't go into the east wing alone until an inspector clears it." She paused. "That last part is official." Caleb nodded. Understood. But Nora did not follow when he climbed the porch steps. She remained at the edge of the drive while Caleb fitted the key into the front door. It resisted at first, metal grinding inside old metal, then turned with a heavy click that seemed to move through the whole house. The door opened inward. A breath of cold air drifted out, carrying the smell of dust, damp wood, stone, and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like flowers left too long in a closed room. Ranger stepped across the threshold first. Caleb followed. The entry hall stretched before them, broad and dim, with a cracked marble floor and a staircase rising into shadow. White sheets covered furniture along the walls, their shapes hunched and waiting. A chandelier hung overhead, missing crystals, catching the weak afternoon light in dull flashes. Somewhere deeper inside, water dripped once. Then again. The sound traveled through the rooms like a slow heartbeat. Caleb let the door fall shut behind him. The noise echoed longer than it should have. "Well," he said softly, "we're here." Ranger did not move toward the smell of old upholstery or the kitchen or the stairs the way Caleb expected. Instead, the dog stopped in the center of the hall, lifted his nose, and drew in the air. His body changed, not tense exactly, but certain. He turned and walked past the staircase, down the left side of the hall, over warped floorboards, and through a wash of gray light. Caleb followed, boots sounding too loud in the quiet. Ranger. The dog did not turn. He passed a parlor with a collapsed curtain rod, a dining room where a long table slept beneath dust, and a portrait turned face in toward the wall. At the end of the hall stood a dark wooden door with an old brass plate, nearly black with age. The library, sealed by age more than by any lock. Ranger stopped before it. For several seconds he only stared. Then, very gently, he raised one paw and placed it against the door, not scratching, not pushing, just touching it, the way a person might touch the shoulder of someone grieving. Caleb felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. Behind him, Nora called from the porch, her voice faint through the walls. "Everything all right in there?" Caleb looked down at Ranger, then at the sealed door. The house was silent around them, but not empty. Not anymore. "Yeah," he called back, though he was no longer sure it was true. Ranger kept his paw on the wood, and deep inside the Whitcomb house, something gave the smallest settling creak, like a sleeper turning toward a voice it recognized. Caleb spent his first night in the Whitcomb house beneath a ceiling that looked too high for any man to sleep under. The upstairs rooms were still unsafe. The east wing smelled of damp plaster, and the kitchen windows had gaps wide enough for the wind to slip through like fingers. So he laid his sleeping bag in the grand hall near the broken fireplace, with Ranger stretched across the front door, as if the old mansion had already become a post worth guarding. The fire would not catch at first. The chimney breathed smoke back into the room, gray and bitter, and Caleb had to open the front door until the cold swept through and cleared the air. He stood there in his coat, watching moonlight gather on the cracked marble floor, and for a moment the house seemed embarrassed by its own ruin. "It's all right," he murmured, though he was not sure whether he was speaking to Ranger, to the house, or to himself. By morning, frost had silvered the inside corners of the windows. Caleb woke with a stiff back, folded his sleeping bag with the same care he once gave a uniform, and began with the smallest things, because small things were all he could afford. He swept broken glass into a coffee can. He pulled rotten leaves from the porch steps. He wedged cardboard into a cracked pane until he could find scrap wood. He opened curtains that had not moved in years, and dust rose into the pale light like something finally allowed to leave. Ranger followed him from room to room, quiet and watchful, sometimes pausing at the sealed library door, sometimes lying in a square of sunlight, as if testing whether the house still remembered warmth. Caleb worked without music. The house supplied enough sound, the groan of old pipes, the tick of cooling wood, the slow drip somewhere behind the walls. At noon, he sat on the bottom step and ate crackers with peanut butter, sharing the last corner with Ranger, who accepted it gently, and then nudged Caleb's hand as if to remind him that eating was not optional. Outside the gates, cars slowed. Some did not even pretend otherwise. Faces turned toward the mansion, toward the man patching a door with salvaged plywood, toward Ranger sitting beside him like a dark statue. By the second day, the story had spread through Alder Creek with the speed of gossip and the shape of entertainment. Claire Whitman's article appeared on the front page of the Alder Creek Ledger beneath a photograph taken from the road. The iron gate, Caleb's truck, the gray mansion looming behind it. The headline read, "A man with no home buys the biggest house in town." Caleb found a copy on the diner counter when he went in for coffee. No one handed it to him. It was simply there, folded open like a dare. He read the first paragraph while standing by the register, Ranger waiting just outside the door under the awning. The words were polished, amused, careful, almost too polite to be called cruel, which made them worse. They called him a local transient veteran. They called the house a relic of organized crime folklore. They wondered whether Caleb Rowan had found hope, madness, or the first clue to the Mallory fortune. A man in a work vest at the counter laughed into his cup. Maybe the dog's guarding the ghost money. Another voice said, "Give him a week. That place'll spit him right back out." Caleb folded the paper neatly. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes went farther away. He paid for the coffee, left a quarter beside the cup, and said, "Thank you, Mom," to the waitress, who suddenly became very interested in wiping the counter. Back at the house, he used the article to start the fire. Not because he was angry. Anger took energy, and Caleb had only so much of that. He burned it because the hall was cold, and because paper, whatever was printed on it, still had the mercy of becoming heat. The next morning, just after sunrise, he heard gravel crunching beyond the gate. Ranger lifted his head but did not growl. A small blue Subaru rolled up the drive, slow and careful, and stopped near the porch. The woman who stepped out was thin, gray-haired, and steady on her feet, wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a dented metal thermos in one hand and a canvas tool bag in the other. "Mr. Rowan?" she called. Caleb stood from where he had been scraping old paint from a window frame. People rarely used Mr. with his name anymore. It struck him harder than he expected. "Yes, Mom. Ruth Bellamy," she said. "I used to run the town library before they decided a town without readers needed more parking." Her eyes moved over the porch, the patched window, the broom leaning by the door, then finally to Ranger. "Handsome dog." Ranger approached, sniffed her glove, and sat. Ruth nodded, as if he had passed judgment on her character. She held out the thermos. "Coffee, still hot, and I brought a hammer, nails, a level, and 2 screwdrivers. One of them is older than you, but it works better than most people." Caleb stared at the offering. For a moment he did not know what to do with kindness that did not ask him to explain himself first. "Mom, I can't pay for. I didn't ask you to." She looked up at the mansion, and her expression softened, not with pity, but recognition. A house doesn't become a home because people approve of it. Then she looked back at him. "Now, do you need the hammer or the nails first?" Caleb lowered his eyes, not to hide shame this time, but to steady something rising in his chest. Behind him, the Whitcomb house stood in the thin morning light, still broken, still cold, but no longer entirely alone. Ranger leaned against Caleb's leg, and for the first time since the auction, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe repair did not always begin with money. Sometimes it began with one person refusing to laugh. The wind came hard over Hawthorne Ridge that night, bending the bare branches against the windows until they scratched the glass like nervous fingers. Caleb had gone to sleep beside the broken fireplace with his coat still on, one arm tucked beneath his head, the other resting where Ranger usually slept close enough for his breath to be heard in the dark. But sometime after midnight, Caleb woke to absence. It was not a sound that pulled him out of sleep. It was the lack of one, no steady breathing, no weight of warm fur near his boots. Only the wind, the slow drip behind the wall, and the old mansion shifting around him in its uneasy sleep. He opened his eyes. The fire had fallen to a dull red glow, and shadows leaned long across the marble floor. "Ranger," he called, his voice still rough with sleep. Nothing answered. Caleb sat up too quickly, the cold finding the back of his neck. For a second, the house felt larger than it had during the day, as though the darkness had added rooms. He reached for the flashlight beside his sleeping bag and stood, listening. Then he heard it. Not a bark, not a whine, but a soft scrape from the far hallway, faint as a match being struck behind a closed door. Caleb crossed the grand hall in his socks first, then stopped, put on his boots and moved toward the sound. The beam of his flashlight slid over covered chairs, cracked plaster, a portrait turned toward the wall, and the long corridor where the air always seemed colder. At the end of it, the library door stood open. Caleb slowed. That door had been stuck shut since the first day. He had checked it twice. Now the warped frame had pulled away from the latch, leaving the door hanging half an inch open, one hinge sagging as if it had finally grown too tired to hold a secret in place. Inside, Ranger stood before a bookcase that reached nearly to the ceiling. The dog did not look frightened. That was what made Caleb's chest tighten. Ranger was focused, still certain. His ears were forward, his tail low but not tucked, and one paw rested against the bottom shelf with delicate pressure. "How'd you get in here, boy?" Caleb whispered. Ranger turned his head only long enough to meet his eyes, then scratched once at the base of the shelf. Not frantic, not playful, a request. Caleb stepped into the room. The library smelled of dust, old paper, and rainwater trapped somewhere behind the stone. Books lined 3 walls, some swollen from moisture, some fallen sideways like exhausted men. A green-shaded desk lamp sat dead on a writing table. Heavy curtains covered the windows, but one had torn loose, allowing moonlight to spill in a pale stripe across the floor. Ranger scratched again, then stepped back. Caleb set the flashlight on the desk, took hold of the tall bookcase, and pulled. At first it did not move. He braced one boot against the floor and tried again. The wood groaned. Dust broke loose in a soft gray cloud. Inch by inch the case shifted forward, its hidden feet dragging across the boards with a low, reluctant moan. Behind it, the wall was wrong. Caleb knew it before he understood why. The brickwork was different there, newer than the surrounding stone, the mortar rougher, uneven, hurried. The rest of the room had the patient craftsmanship of another century, but this patch looked like a wound closed in the dark by hands that wanted only to hide the bleeding. Caleb lifted the flashlight. The beam trembled slightly in his grip. "Well," he said quietly, "that's not supposed to be there." Ranger sat beside him, eyes fixed on the wall. Caleb went back to the hall for Ruth Bellamy's old tool bag, then returned with a small hammer and chisel. He did not smash. Something about the room forbade it. Instead, he worked slowly, tapping at the mortar, loosening one brick at a time. Each sound traveled through the library and out into the house, measured and hollow, like an old clock counting backward. Dust powdered his sleeves. His fingers scraped against rough edges. The wind pressed against the windows, then fell away. After nearly an hour, one brick came free, then another. Behind the wall was a narrow cavity lined with blackened wood. Inside sat a metal box wrapped in oilcloth, its corners rusted but intact. Caleb reached in carefully and drew it out. It was heavier than it looked. By then the fire in the hall had nearly died, so he carried the box to the kitchen, where one weak yellow bulb still worked above the table. Ranger followed close, his nails clicking softly on the floorboards. Caleb unwrapped the oilcloth. The metal beneath was cold and smelled faintly of iron and time. There was no lock, only a clasp stiff with age. He opened it and found no stack of cash, no diamonds, no shining relic from the stories people told at the diner. Just a handful of black and white photographs, curled at the edges, a brown leather notebook, a faded badge from the Alder Creek steel mill, a military identification tag on a broken chain. On the back, almost worn smooth, someone had scratched 4 small numbers, 1111, and folded beneath everything else, a piece of cream-colored paper with one sentence written in careful, slanted handwriting. For the men who came home and found no door open. Caleb read it once, then again. The kitchen seemed to grow very quiet. Even the wind held back from the glass. He touched the identification tag with one finger, not lifting it yet, as if names deserved permission before being disturbed. Something inside him tightened, then softened in a place he had spent years protecting. Men who came home and found no door open. He knew that sentence. Not the ink, not the handwriting, but the shape of it. He knew the way a town could hang flags in November and still look through a man in December. He knew how a door could be closed politely, how opportunity could smile while stepping aside, how loneliness could arrive not all at once, but room by room, until a person discovered he was standing outside his own life. Ranger moved closer and laid his muzzle across Caleb's knee. Caleb did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What were you hiding, Mr. Mallory?" Ranger's eyes lifted to him, calm and unreadable. In the yellow kitchen light, with dust on his hands and the old mansion breathing around him, Caleb understood that the Whitcomb house had not given up a treasure. It had given up a question, and somehow that was far heavier. Caleb did not sleep after opening the box. The kitchen bulb hummed above him, weak and yellow, throwing a small circle of light over the scarred table, while the rest of the room stayed folded in shadow. Rain had returned sometime after midnight, not in a storm now, but in a steady tapping against the windows, soft as knuckles asking permission to enter. Ranger lay beneath the table, with his body pressed against Caleb's boots, his ears rising now and then whenever the house settled. The brown leather notebook sat open in Caleb's hands. Its pages were brittle at the edges, but the handwriting was careful, almost elegant, the kind made by a man who had time, education, and too much he could no longer say aloud. At first, Caleb expected numbers, names, some hidden record of debts, favors, old deals, dressed in polite language. That was the kind of thing Alder Creek believed Silas Mallory would leave behind. But the first page held only a date from 16 years earlier, and a sentence that made Caleb sit very still. A man may build a house large enough for the whole town to see, and still fail to leave one door open for his own blood. Caleb read it twice, then turned the page. Silas had written about the steel mill before he wrote about money. He described the sound of whistles at dawn, lunch pails swinging from tired hands, boots blackened by dust, men coming home with faces lined by heat and pride. His father had worked there for 31 years, long enough for his shoulders to round and his lungs to carry the mill even on Sundays. Thomas Mallory, Silas's older brother, had left Alder Creek in uniform and returned years later, quieter than anyone knew what to do with. No parade waited for him. No job held his name. People shook his hand too firmly at first, then avoided the hard parts of conversation. They asked if he was glad to be home, but not whether home still knew him. The mill would not take him back. The bank would not extend credit. Men who once slapped his back at the bar began speaking around him instead of to him. Caleb stopped reading and stared at the rain-streaked window. He could see his own reflection there, hollowed by the kitchen light, a man sitting inside a mansion that still did not feel like his. Ranger shifted under the table and pressed one paw over Caleb's boot. Caleb looked down but said nothing. The next line in the notebook waited, like a hand laid flat against his chest. My brother did not die in a foreign place. He died one closed door at a time. Caleb swallowed hard. He hated how well he understood it. Not the exact life, not the exact years, but the slow vanishing. The way people could honor the idea of a man while refusing the reality of him. The way a town could hang flags, print speeches, clap at ceremonies, and still leave a person standing outside in the cold with his whole life in a duffel bag. The pages that followed changed shape. Silas did not ask to be admired. If anything, his words had the weight of a man sitting in judgment over himself. He wrote of ambition that had curdled into hunger, of favors accepted from men whose smiles never reached their eyes, of contracts steered, accounts buried, signatures purchased with promises no decent person should have made. He never called himself innocent. He never polished the dirt from his own name. I learned how to open every door in this town. One page read, except the one my brother needed most. Caleb leaned back slowly. The house creaked above him. Long and low, not frightening now, only old. Somewhere beyond the kitchen, wind moved through a cracked frame and made the walls sigh. Silas had spent the last years of his life trying to shape a repair he knew would never balance the damage. He had named it the Lantern House. Not a shelter exactly, not a charity meant to make donors feel clean. A place where people could walk in without explaining their entire ruin at the door. A place with hot coffee, clean showers, workbenches, books, job boards, quiet rooms, legal help twice a month, and a front desk where every visitor would be called by name. Veterans, mill workers left behind by a town that had sold its machinery for scrap. Older men and women eating dinner alone under buzzing apartment lights. People just released from the hospital, or those who had learned to become small, so others would feel comfortable ignoring them. Caleb turned another page and found a sketch of the Whitcomb house, redrawn in pencil. The ballroom labeled Community Supper Hall, the library labeled Reading Room and Employment Desk, the garage labeled Skills Workshop, the kitchen labeled Meal Service, with one smaller word written beneath. It in Silas's hand, warmth. That word undid him more than the money ever could have. Not rescue, not pity, not a lecture, just warmth, the kind a man could step into without having to earn his humanity first. Caleb closed his eyes, and for a moment the mansion around him seemed to tilt away from its own legend. It was still cracked stone, rotten wood, rusted iron, and bad history. But beneath all that there was the outline of something else. Not innocence, never that. A ruined man's attempt to leave behind a door that would not close so easily. Ranger lifted his head and rested his muzzle on Caleb's knee. Caleb placed his hand between the dog's ears, his fingers trembling once before becoming still. "He was no saint," Caleb whispered. The word disappeared into the kitchen. Then, after a long pause, he added, "But maybe he knew what it meant to lose sight of a person." Dawn had begun to pale the windows by the time Caleb reached the final page written in that section. Silas had pressed harder there, the ink darker, the letters less steady. "If anyone finds this, do not make me clean. Make the house useful." Caleb looked around the kitchen, the peeling paint, the old stove, the dust on the windowsill, Ranger breathing softly at his feet. For the first time since the auction, the Whitcomb house did not look like a curse or a joke or even a refuge. It looked like an apology left unfinished on the table, waiting for someone with enough hurt in him to understand where repair might begin. The notebook did not let Caleb go when morning came. It stayed open on the kitchen table long after the first gray light crossed the floorboards. Its pages breathing out the life of a man, Alder Creek had turned into a warning. Caleb should have been exhausted, but the kind of truth he had found did not make sleep easier. It sharpened the quiet. It made every old sound in the Whitcomb house feel deliberate. The pipe ticking inside the wall, the wind pressing at the eaves, the slow creak from somewhere below, as if the foundation itself had shifted in its dreams. Ranger heard it before Caleb did. The shepherd lifted his head from beneath the table, ears forward, body still. Caleb looked down. "Again?" he whispered. Ranger stood, crossed the kitchen, and stopped at the basement door. It was narrow and warped, painted the same dull cream as the wall. Easy to overlook if you were not a dog. listening to things human beings had forgotten how to hear. Caleb took the flashlight, slipped the notebook into his jacket pocket, and opened the door. Cold air climbed up from below, wet and mineral, carrying the smell of stone, old metal, and something faintly sour from years of trapped dampness. The stairs groaned under his boots. Ranger went first, careful but certain, each step measured, his black and tan body disappearing into the beam of light. The basement was lower than Caleb expected, with walls furred in moss and water stains spreading like faded maps across the concrete. Shelves sagged under empty jars. A rusted boiler squatted in one corner. The floor held shallow puddles that reflected the flashlight in broken pieces. Caleb swept the beam across the room and saw nothing but neglect. Ranger did not hesitate. He moved toward the far wall, where an old wine cabinet stood crooked beneath a row of cobwebbed beams. It was empty, its glass long gone, its wood swollen from moisture. Ranger pressed his nose to the side of it, then looked back. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right, boy. Let's see what else this place forgot to mention." He pulled. The cabinet resisted, then gave with a wet scrape, dragging across the floor just enough to reveal a low wooden door behind it, no taller than Caleb's chest. There was no knob, only a recessed iron ring blackened with age. He hooked 2 fingers through it and tugged. The door opened inward with a sigh of stale air so deep it seemed to come from another decade. Inside was a small sealed room, dry compared to the rest of the basement, as though someone had taken care to protect it. Caleb ducked through. His flashlight found a wooden desk, a black typewriter under a cloth, a radio set with cracked dials, maps of Alder Creek pinned to the walls, stacks of envelopes tied with string, and an oil lamp with its glass chimney clouded by time. No city inventory had ever mentioned this room. Caleb could understand why. A condemned basement, a rotten wine cabinet, and a door built low enough to disappear behind neglect would not have tempted any clerk paid to count furniture and leave before dark. It was not frightening, and that unsettled him more. The room felt purposeful, patient, like a man had sat there night after night, not hiding treasure, but trying to reach people without letting them know who had sent the light. On one wall, dozens of addresses had been written in careful columns. Caleb's first thought was debt. Old accounts, names Silas Mallory had once owned in the invisible way powerful men own things. He did not touch anything until Ruth Bellamy arrived that afternoon, wrapped in her dark coat, carrying reading glasses, and the kind of silence people bring into rooms where the past is still awake. She studied the wall for a long time. "These aren't debts," she said finally. Caleb turned toward her. "How can you tell?" Ruth lifted a trembling finger to one address. This was Mrs. Halpern's place. Her roof caved in after the mill closed. Nobody knew where the repair money came from. She pointed to another. That one belonged to Earl Maddox. Medicine bills. Folks passed a hat, but it was never enough. Then somehow it was paid. She stopped there, troubled by what she could not yet prove. "The rest I don't know by heart," she said, "but I know where to look." By evening, old newspapers, church bulletins, and Ruth's careful notes had begun turning the wall of addresses into something Caleb had not expected. A map of quiet mercy. Caleb looked back at the names. The room grew larger around him, not in size but in meaning. Silas Mallory had not merely dreamed of the Lantern House. Before he vanished, he had already been building it in secret, one envelope at a time, one closed door forced gently open without anyone seeing his hand. Ranger sniffed beneath the desk and nudged something forward with his paw. A thick envelope slid into the flashlight beam. Caleb bent and picked it up. On the front, written in the same slanted hand, were the words, "If I am gone, find the safe behind the stone that faces the morning." Inside the desk drawer, Ruth found folded blueprints of the Whitcomb house, each room relabeled in pencil. Ballroom to community supper hall, library to reading room and employment desk, garage to skills workshop, east rooms to temporary rest space, and kitchen to meal service, with one smaller word written beneath it, warmth. Ruth took off her glasses and pressed them against her chest. Caleb said nothing. Some discoveries demanded quiet first. Above them, the old mansion settled in the afternoon wind, and for the first time, Caleb understood that the house had not been empty all those years. It had been waiting with its hands full. Morning entered the Whitcomb house like something cautious. It did not flood the rooms all at once. It slipped in narrow and pale through the cracked eastern windows, touched the dust above the banister, moved across the floorboards, and finally came to rest in the old study where Silas Mallory's desk still sat facing the hills. Caleb had not thought much about that room before. It was smaller than the library, quieter than the ballroom, and less dramatic than the hidden radio room beneath the basement. But when he stood in its doorway with Ruth Bellamy's words still turning in his mind and the envelope folded in his hand, he understood why a man like Silas might have chosen it. The study faced the morning, not the town, not the road, not the iron gate where people once came asking for favors or forgiveness. The morning ranger was already there. The shepherd sat before the fireplace, perfectly still, his ears forward, his body dark against the gray stone. He did not scratch this time. He did not whine. He simply waited, as if patience itself had fur and amber eyes. Caleb stepped inside slowly. The room smelled of cold ash, old leather, and damp paper. A single white stone sat at the back of the fireplace, different from the others, smoother, almost clean beneath the soot. The first blade of sunlight had found it and rested there like a finger pointing. Caleb crouched, touched the stone, and felt a thin seam along its edge. "Stone that faces the morning," he whispered. Ranger's tail moved once against the floor. Caleb went for the tool bag. His hands were steady at first, then less so. He told himself it was the cold. He knew it was not. Some doors, once opened, did not just reveal a room. They changed the shape of the life standing outside them. He worked the chisel carefully along the seam, loosening grit and old mortar without breaking the stone. The house was quiet around him. No dripping pipes, no wind at the shutters. Even Ruth, standing in the hall with one hand at her throat, did not speak. At last the white stone shifted. Caleb gripped it with both hands and pulled. Behind it, set deep into the wall, was a small iron safe. Black with age, its dial dulled but intact. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Caleb leaned closer. There were no numbers scratched nearby, no convenient clue, no theatrical message, only the safe and the silence. Caleb thought of the numbers on the back of Thomas Mallory's dog tag, 1111. He thought of Silas writing about men who came home to no open door. He thought of cold mornings behind Miller's stop and the small ceremonies where people clapped for service, then crossed the street from the served. His eyes lowered to the dial. 1111, he said softly. Veterans Day. Caleb turned the dial with care. Right, left, right again. The metal resisted like a memory reluctant to return. Then, with a small click, the safe opened. It was such a quiet sound for so much weight. Caleb pulled the door wide, and the Whitcomb house seemed to breathe through every wall. Inside were folders wrapped in waxed paper, bank records sealed in stiff envelopes, a legal document titled the Lantern Trust, a property transfer schedule, letters addressed to the Alder Creek Town Council, and a handwritten list of assets moved into trust before Silas vanished. A faded seizure inventory lay among the papers, too, listing furniture, vehicles, visible accounts, and nothing more. No one had torn open a fireplace in a condemned mansion everyone wanted to leave behind. At the very bottom lay another dog tag, darker than the first, bearing the name Thomas E. Mallory, and beside it, a final letter sealed but never mailed. Caleb opened only the loose note on top. The handwriting was weaker than in the notebook, the ink pressed unevenly into the paper. Forgiveness is not owed, but repair is still required. He read it aloud, and the sentence settled into the room with the heaviness of a bell. Ruth took the bank envelope with both hands and unfolded the summary page. Her lips parted. She looked at Caleb, then back at the paper. "Roughly $2.9 million, she said, almost too quietly to hear. Caleb did not smile. The number did not enter him as fortune. It entered like weather, like a storm seen forming beyond the ridge. Ruth read on. The original funds, together with accrued interest and court-held assets tied to Silas Mallory's estate, had been frozen for 16 years. They could be petitioned for release only if the Whitcomb house was restored according to the original charitable purpose. The Lantern House, a community refuge for adults without stable shelter, work, care, or companionship. Caleb sat back on his heels. His palms were black with soot. Ranger moved closer and pressed his shoulder against him. From the outside, maybe this was the moment people would imagine differently. A man with no home finding millions hidden in a Mafia mansion. A miracle. A headline. A reason to shout. But Caleb felt no triumph. He felt the terrible size of being believed by the dead before the living had even tried. "They'll never trust me with this," he said. Ruth looked at him, her eyes wet but clear. "Then we make them trust the truth." Caleb stared at the open safe. The white morning light had widened across the fireplace now, touching the folders, the dog tag, the note, his scraped hands. He understood then that Silas Mallory had not left him money. He had left him responsibility, and in some ways responsibility was far heavier, because money could be counted, but a promise had to be carried. Marcus Hale's office sat above the old pharmacy on Mercer Street, where the stairs leaned slightly to the left, and the hallway smelled of lemon polish, dust, and paper that had waited too long to matter. Caleb climbed those stairs with the metal box under one arm, the trust folders wrapped in a brown grocery bag, and Ranger moving beside him with the quiet seriousness of a witness. Marcus was 57, broad through the shoulders, with tired gray eyes and a tie loosened before noon. He had the look of a man who had spent half his life watching people bring him trouble folded neatly into envelopes. When Caleb placed the documents on his desk, Marcus did not touch them right away. He looked at Caleb, then at Ranger, then at the old waxed folders as if the past had walked in wet from the rain and asked for a chair. "You understand how this sounds?" "Right," he said. Caleb stood with his cap in both hands. His knuckles were scraped from the fireplace stone. His jacket still carried the smell of soot. "I do," he answered. "That doesn't make it false." Something in Marcus's face changed, not belief exactly, but the beginning of caution. He put on his glasses and opened the first folder. One page became 10. 10 became a stack. The room grew quiet except for the whisper of old paper and Ranger's breathing near the door. By the time Marcus reached the bank summaries, he had stopped looking at Caleb like a man telling a strange story and started looking at the documents like they might tell one stranger still. "This will need verification," he said at last. "Court records, bank seals, municipal archives, notary logs. If the trust is real, it's been buried under 16 years of legal dust." Caleb nodded. "How long?" Marcus leaned back. "Weeks, maybe months." The answer landed heavily. But Caleb had learned that waiting was part of every system built by people who had homes to wait in. Over the next days, the folders left Marcus' office only in copies. Calls were made to Harrisburg, then Philadelphia, then a bank branch that no longer existed except in merger records. Ruth spent afternoons in the basement of the old library, chasing newspaper clippings and property maps. Caleb kept working on the house because stillness made doubt louder. He patched windows, cleared gutters, hauled ruined carpet to the porch. Ranger stayed close, but the town moved closer too. Claire Whitman's second article appeared on Thursday. Mafia fortune found by homeless veteran? This time, people did not simply laugh. They argued. Cars slowed longer at the gate. Men at the diner lowered their voices when Caleb entered, which was worse than laughing, because it meant they wanted him to know he was being discussed carefully. One woman at the grocery store said the city should never have sold the mansion to someone unstable. A man outside the hardware store asked Caleb whether he planned to buy a yacht with mob money. Caleb kept his eyes forward. "It isn't mine," he said. "That's convenient," the man replied, smiling with all his teeth and none of his warmth. The pressure did not come like a storm. It came like fog, slipping under doors, dulling every edge of the day. At the town council meeting, Caleb sat in the back with Ranger beneath his chair while Marcus explained the preliminary findings. The council chamber smelled of old varnish and wet coats. Claire sat near the aisle, pen ready. A councilman named Everett Sloan adjusted his microphone and spoke in the smooth voice people used when they wanted disrespect to sound responsible. "We appreciate Mr. Rowan's service," he said, "but this is a serious estate matter." A few heads nodded. Caleb felt the sentence settle on him like a hand pushing him gently out of the room. Ruth Bellamy stood before he could lower his eyes. She was small under the fluorescent lights, but her voice carried. "Then treat him seriously." The room went still. Caleb looked at her, and for a moment the old habit of disappearing failed him. That night, however, the words came back sharper. "We appreciate his service, but," always the but. Caleb stood in the grand hall with rain ticking against the boarded windows and packed his duffel by flashlight. Socks, razor, notebook copies. The dog tag he had no right to keep, but could not leave lying cold in a drawer. Ranger watched from near the door. Caleb did not look at him. "Maybe they're right, boy," he said. "Maybe they need someone cleaner than me, someone easier to believe." He opened the truck door. Ranger did not move. "Come on." The dog turned away from the truck, walked back through the rain, climbed the porch steps, and sat in front of the mansion's main door. Water darkened his coat. His ears stayed lifted. Caleb stood beside the truck, anger rising first because anger was easier than heartbreak. "Ranger." The dog remained still. Not stubborn, faithful. Caleb's breath shook. Finally, he crossed the gravel and opened the door. Ranger walked inside and stopped at the staircase. Caleb followed with the flashlight beam, trembling ahead of him. On the underside of the banister, nearly hidden where the wood curved into shadow, were words carved small and deep. "Leave the light on." Caleb stared until the letters blurred. He understood then that the house was not asking him to be worthy in the way the town measured worth. It was asking him not to abandon the promise, just because people found him difficult to trust. He sat on the bottom step, rainwater dripping from his sleeves, and Ranger laid his head against Caleb's chest. Before sunrise, the phone rang. Marcus's voice came through rough with disbelief and relief. "The first filings are real, Caleb. The trust references, the signatures, the estate records. Real enough to begin." Caleb closed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Marcus exhaled. "It means this isn't over. It means we petition the court, build an independent board, and do this clean." 3 weeks passed before the official confirmation arrived. The Lantern Trust could be restored under supervised restoration. Caleb would not own the funds. He would serve as temporary project steward with an independent board. Caleb did not feel victorious. He felt steadied, like a man whose name had finally been spoken in a room where it mattered. Ranger pressed closer, and beyond the windows, morning began to find the house. Spring came late to Alder Creek that year, as if even the season needed time to believe the old house on Hawthorne Ridge was changing. Snow loosened first along the iron fence, then under the porch steps, then in the long brown garden behind the mansion where dead leaves had slept all winter beneath a crust of ice. Each morning, Caleb opened the front doors before he made coffee. Only the first phase would open that spring. The rest of the mansion would take years. But Caleb had learned that a door did not need to be perfect before it could welcome someone in. He would stand in the grand hall with Ranger beside him and let the pale Pennsylvania light spill across the marble floor, over the repaired banister, up the walls where shadows had lived for too long. "Let the old place breathe," he would say, and Ranger, as if he understood, would walk through the entryway with his nose low, checking each room like a quiet foreman with 4 paws and a soldier's patience. Restoration did not arrive like a miracle. It came in pickup trucks, borrowed ladders, city permits, old men with tool belts, women with paint on their sleeves, coffee in paper cups, and volunteers who looked embarrassed the first time they stepped through the gate. Nobody said much about what they had said before. Alder Creek was not the kind of town that apologized quickly. It brought nails instead. Then lumber, books, a used refrigerator, folding chairs from the church basement, and one Saturday morning, May from the diner arrived with a silver coffee urn and a tray of biscuits. She found Caleb sanding a window frame in the ballroom and set the tray down without ceremony. "Figured folks working this hard shouldn't drink bad coffee," she said. Caleb looked at her, waiting for the old distance in her eyes. It wasn't there. "Thank you, Mom," he said. This time she looked straight at him. "You're welcome, Caleb." That small change moved through him more quietly than praise would have. The ballroom became the supper hall first. Not fancy, not polished into something false, but warm. The cracked mirrors were taken down, the long tables sanded smooth, and the windows washed until the room remembered how to hold sunlight. The library became a reading room and employment desk, with Ruth Bellamy arranging books by hand and scolding anyone who tried to stack boxes too close to the old fireplace. The garage became a skills workshop, where a mechanic named Leon Pike, who had once joked about ghost money, showed up every Saturday to teach basic engine repair, carpentry, and wiring. He never mentioned the joke. One afternoon he handed Caleb a box of new hinges and said, "For the west doors." Caleb accepted them. Forgiveness, he had learned, did not always need a speech. Sometimes it sounded like tools being set on a workbench. The old bathrooms were restored with clean tile, working showers, fresh towels, and mirrors hung at a height where a tired person could look at himself and not feel erased. The sitting room became a place for coffee, music, and quiet conversation. The back garden was cleared row by row until dark soil showed through, and on the first warm Sunday, someone planted tomatoes while Ranger lay in the sun with his eyes half closed, pretending not to watch everyone. Claire Whitman's final article appeared the week the sign was finished. The headline read, "The man we laughed at gave Alder Creek its light back." Caleb read it standing by the front steps, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of Silas Mallory's desk. He did not burn this one. On opening day, the iron gate stood freshly painted, the ivy trimmed but not stripped away, because Caleb said a house should be allowed to keep some of its scars. People gathered beneath a sky the color of washed denim. Marcus Hale stood near Ruth. Nora Keene wiped her eyes and pretended it was the wind. Claire held her notebook closed. Caleb did not give a long speech. He only stood beside Ranger as the canvas was pulled from the new sign. The Lantern House, a place where every person is called by name. For a moment, no one clapped. They just looked. The words seemed to settle over them, asking more than applause. Then Ruth began softly, and the sound grew until it filled the drive, climbed the stone walls, and passed through the open doors. That evening, after the last car left and the supper hall lights were dimmed, Caleb walked alone through the grand hall. The floor still creaked beneath his boots, but it no longer sounded like grief. It sounded like an old body easing into rest. He placed Thomas Mallory's dog tag, Silas's brown notebook, and the court papers for the Lantern Trust on the mantel, above the restored fireplace. Ranger lay down in the glow, his muzzle resting on his paws. Caleb stood there for a long time, watching the flames move behind the iron grate. "We kept the light on," he whispered. Outside, beyond the repaired porch and the painted gate, one yellow lantern burned in the mist, steady enough for anyone lost on the road below to know there was still a door open somewhere. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and tell us which moment hit you hardest and where you are watching from.